So Optiv's a really large organization, about 2.5 billion, thousands of consultants, 60 countries around the world. But one of the things we're passionate about is cybersecurity, because that's all we do. And one of the things I'm really passionate about as CTO and running our strategy is actually about resilience. And resilience being actually, for me, the outcome that we all try to drive towards when you think about security. And it's exactly that I want to talk to you a little bit about today. One of the things, so I spent a lot of time thinking about resilience. I helped lead the World Economic Forum, work around cyber resilience and governance, worked with NATO, and spent quite a bit of time with our friends at the World Health Organization thinking about pandemics and how complex systems can have a whole series of knock-on effects. And you think about H1N1, bird flu, and Ebola. These are, geographically significant global threats dealing with very complex sets of systems. I've been doing this for quite a few years and sort of really started to come to grips with how complex systems are triggered and how in almost all situations failure is part of what happens. We absolutely have to plan for failure and resilience. And then I was asked to go for breakfast, and those of you who know me know I'll never turn down breakfast. I was asked to go for breakfast with two members of the House of Lords. The first thing that you go think, where do you go for breakfast? Very nice place, and what do you wear? I was predictably late, the trains were all over the place, and I sort of rushed in a bit of a haze and sat down. Two lovely, lovely chaps, quite earnest. And they looked at me and over bacon sandwiches, because that's what you have, apparently. They said, what do you think we do when all the lights go out? Now, I wasn't quite expecting that as my opening gambit in the morning over breakfast. And their concern was that we literally very much know what will happen when all the lights go out. We know that if you turn the electricity off, the mobile phone system has about 40 minutes to run. BT will run the fixed line network for 4 days, but who's got a fixed line phone anymore? The emergency broadcast that goes out across the whole country is Radio 4 long wave. How many people have got battery-powered, analog, long-wave radio receivers? If you live in an urban environment like this, depending on the time of day that all of the power goes out, we estimate, from working with all the national police forces, that you've got about 4 hours before lawlessness breaks out. If it happens in the morning, in the daylight hours, it's sort of okay. If it happens evening into the night, about 4 hours before looting, before cars, before everybody starts to get out of the city. So this was my breakfast conversation, which I wasn't really expecting. I'd sort of expected our government relations teams to have prepped me a little bit, but I'd done it on the side and didn't tell them about it, so that was the conversation. And the proposition was, well, what do we do about this? Society is almost completely and entirely reliant on electricity. What do we do about this? So the UK, the US, and Israel leading a big international effort to think about how we respond to this very present, clear and present danger. They see it as one of the most fundamental risks and threats to Western civilization to some extent. When every hospital, when every emergency responder, when every piece of our businesses or our lives relies entirely on electricity, on the lights being on, our ability to communicate and respond in real time, and every single one of our businesses, then what do you do if that goes off? If it goes off for a couple of hours, that's okay. What we developed were something called a black sky event. And I don't know if those of you have heard the phrase, but a black sky event is literally, that's what it means, is when the sky goes black. There's no light from anything. When in a multi-region hemisphere event occurs to turn the lights off. And how do you coordinate that? Fascinating. You can't just turn a power station off and on again, because it needs water to cool it. The water gets there using electric pumps. If it's fuel-driven, there's only a certain amount of time, and the fuel will run out. petrol stations pump the fuel into the lorries to deliver the fuel. The guy who runs all the logistics for Tesco's and emergency response, he said, I've got most of the country's food. It's in 3 warehouses, but if the electricity goes off, I can't coordinate my drivers, I can't fill the trucks with the fuel, and all the drivers will be at home looking after their families. So it's a huge amount of coordination involved. And then to think about what you do in those situations. Actually, what could cause one of those situations? And then you go back to cause and effect. And this is one of the parallels around security is, 64% of organizations, due to our research, are stuck in a purely reactive mode in cybersecurity, which means they're responding to external events. And if you understand the cause, then you can start to think about how you react to that. So we've identified, that's 5, 6. Been counting. I've got little children. I've got to 6 with them now. 6 black sky scenarios, 3 man-made and 3 natural. Things that would turn the electricity off for a hemisphere or multi-region for an extended amount of time. Man-made ones, you can probably guess them. High altitude nuclear explosion, massive EMP, sustained deliberate cyber attack. Which one of those do we think is most likely? I know which one I hope is most likely, right? The natural ones, huge earthquake, massive weather event, hurricane, tsunami, knocking out, that would literally knock out huge amounts. And the third, this is what I want to talk to you about a little bit now, is space weather. I was sitting in sort of these wonderful meetings with, heads of government thinking about global response to black sky events. And a lot of our time was spent talking about space weather. I find it a little interesting. So, space weather comes from the sun. I don't know, again, some of you may know about space weather. The sun has a north and a south pole, much like most planets. However, the sun's poles swap every 11 years. The sun doesn't change, the poles literally change, the magnetic fields change. So that every 11 years is what we call a solar cycle. When the poles are furthest apart, that's the trough of the solar cycle, when as they cross, the absolute peak of solar activity. And that's where we get sunspots and solar flares. And it's these solar flares, which is the key bit of space weather that people worry about. And I had to sit thinking, how on earth could space weather be something so fundamentally dangerous to our existence that would turn off the lights to everything? And they said, well, let me tell you a little bit about it. The last most significant space weather event was called the Carrington event in 1859. And it was this guy, Richard Carrington, who observed it. He was a member of the Royal Astronomical Society. He'd spent the previous summer counting the stars in Sweden, because that's in summer. I wouldn't have gone to Sweden in summer to count stars because of the amount of nighttime there is. But he did it, and he counted every star that was below 5 degrees in the sky. And then he decided he was going to change his area of study to think about the sun. So he would set up in his home lab, he'd set up his telescope, and he'd project onto a wall the surface of the sun and would draw around any features he saw, which were, solar flares and things bubbling up. And he started to notice a massive amount of activity at the end of August. And this is what he drew. And you can see, he started to see all of these different solar flares happening. And please note, the little black dot is the Earth to scale. Your sun is about, 150 million miles from the Earth? Literally at the speed of light, So he was seeing these things about 8 minutes after they happened. He started to see more and more stuff. It was 1859, sketched it out. And then he also started tracking and measuring the magnetic fluctuations on Earth, where he was, in Greenwich. And this was a couple of days before. 17 hours after he first saw those flares, that's what happened. The deviation is negative to positive magnetism. Now, at that point, there wasn't a huge amount of electric dependency, but telegraph wires across the states exploded. The few electrical items that were in existence just started kicking to life themselves. Some of the most spectacular northern lights that anybody's ever seen plastered across the sky. But luckily, the world wasn't dependent on electricity at that point. The belief now is if there was another Carrington event, Carrington-class event, an X-scale piece of space weather, would cause catastrophic impacts. And then the next question I always had was, well, yeah, but this is probability, it's likelihood. You know, the probability of an asteroid hitting the Earth is, in any given time, almost nil. We can see these things from miles away, and said, no, literally, we'll see it within 8 minutes, and we've got 17 hours to prepare for that. So what are you going to do with the 17 hours you've got left before everything gets turned off, everything gets melted, every piece of wiring, every transformer? You know, hospitals do have really great backup power generation, but a hospital without clean water isn't much use either. So that's the kind of thing. And my question was, well, how often does this really happen? Is this a real, credible threat that we should be planning against in terms of resiliency? And naturally, I'm thinking that if the space weather events like to happen, I can learn all the parallels to how we respond in real time to a cyber event. There have been quite an interesting series around each 11-year cycle when you get the trough, the peaks and troughs of the solar activity and the magnetism switch, you get some really interesting activity. So towards the end of the Vietnam War, the US scattered about 10,000 marine mines in Haiphong Harbor, because about 80% of their shipping went in and out of that particular harbor. That was their way of trying to close down things without landing people. It's hugely effective. A little while later, about 2 months later, about half of those mines simultaneously exploded due to a solar weather event. I guess the guy who laid them would have thinking, did I set the timer right? Damn, that was a hell of a career-limiting thing to do. 4,000 mines just exploded in 30 seconds. That's significant. That's a significant impact. All sorts of other stuff happened. That was the big one. That's what happens when you leave bombs lying around in the sea, I expect. In Quebec, in 1989, there was quite a large solar flare event, but it was localized. Everybody went outside to look at the beautiful northern lights, and in literally 90 seconds, the electricity was turned off to 6 million people. Luckily, most of the Quebec water comes from hydroelectric dams. They were able to restart it, but they had no electricity for 6 million people for days. And it happened just like that. And it's not just the effect on, on bits of the Earth that we're sort of really tracking. And I was wondering, well, what on earth would happen if you were in space when space weather hit? Because we're on Earth. Of course, later that year, in 1989, another one of the peaks in that solar cycle, Space Shuttle Atlantis, 34th space transport mission, went off, actually delivering the Galileo space probe. That was their mission. They went up. It was delayed by four days due to actual weather. They didn't track space weather at that point, so they went in. Remember, there's only there's a 8-minute lag, so it's really hard to predict space weather. But they sent the shuttle up. And look at their smiling faces. This was the crew. Every space mission has a log of things that went wrong. The gas generator went. The fuel system broke. The oxygen manifold and their ability to recover water. And they were like, we've got redundant systems, this is all okay. This is why NASA spends so much time building space shuttles to put into space, and it's all okay. At or around day 3, they got a large space weather event came through, and because they were in, high orbit, it was quite acute. They ran into the most shielded bit of the shuttle and sat and waited for it to happen. And a couple of the astronauts report that they could see the bright lights through their eyelids. It's not where I would want to be. One thing I found really, really interesting was Every day a shuttle's in space, they have a morning song. The crew agrees on a morning song that's played for them from Houston or wherever it is. And the song is chosen normally based on a personal connection that the astronauts have to their university or their school, and it's normally some terrible university song that they play every morning. Morning 4, and there's just a delicious irony. Morning 4, they played Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen. And then were rushed due to space weather into the depths of it. Thunderbolts and lightning, very, very frightening. Galileo was the probe they were sending into space. I just thought, there's something in that. I'm not sure what but it amuses me no end when you actually look at these things and how they play out. And that's where they were, sitting, possibly reading those things through their closed eyelids. And we had one. We just missed one in 2012. It missed us by 2 weeks. So as the Earth orbits round and the solar flare came out, just missed actually the southern hemisphere at that point. So depending on which bit of the southern hemisphere, you don't do much, or you do quite a lot of damage. And the predicted chance of a catastrophe in the next solar cycle to about 2024, as we're at the lowest point now, and we expect it's going to start to go up, is about 12%, which I find phenomenal. I can't begin to judge these things, but I now have a huge appreciation for space weather and its implications on our reliance on technology. And actually, that's sort of a long circular way of talking about space weather, coming back to our reliance on all digital technologies and how cybersecurity, as one of the 6 other black sky scenarios, is actually the one we are most able to control, the one we're most able to understand, and to some extent, one of the most disruptive. Do you think about most of those other events? They're one-time events. There's a degree of coordination or not. The naturally occurring black sky events are point-in-time activities. However, a sustained, ambitious, destructive cyber attack could carry on for weeks, depending on why it's being propagated. So we really do know what will happen when the lights go off, and we've seen it in really isolated incidents, whether it's Andy picking up the pieces at Maersk, whether it's the NHS, whether it's somebody stealing my or your identities. That's huge disruption. But when that occurs over a wide scale, then we start to really feel that. And our organizations are first online to that when we think about resilience. And we think about every single one of those digital interactions that we rely on as organizations, as people, as society. Can you imagine what would happen if Twitter was turned off in the White House? Actually, that's maybe not such a bad thing. At a complete aside, I don't know if you've seen, there's a Volfefe index built by JP Morgan Chase that measures the economic instability caused by Donald Trump's tweets. And they're predicting the impact on the US bond market based on his tweets. It's fabulous. There's a lovely graph of it, and they've plotted every tweet and the impact. And whenever he mentions the Federal Reserve or trade, the US bond market swings. So maybe some of those digital interactions we could turn off. That wouldn't be such a bad thing. But we are massively over-reliant on technology and, to some extent, cybersecurity itself. And our proposition is that we've approached security from a control base up. And this is why I think it's genuinely broken. We talk about people, process, and technology, and we never actually, we talk about it in that order, but we flip it when we implement it. We implement tech, then process, then people, and it's completely false. And we are introducing massive complexity in how we deliver security for those complex systems. And it need not introduce or create additional complexity. And I think some of that stems massively from, we can't measure resilience. So if resilience is the outcome, security is the activity, an attack or a vulnerability is the start of the process, all we've been doing is focusing on measuring the attack in the middle, not the resiliency as the outcome. When we know that every 14 seconds around the world a ransomware attack is being propagated, when we know that there are, in the nicest possible sense, thousands of vendors, and every line represents a vendor. That line there is 1,199. But That's the haystack we look at when we think about vendors, because we shouldn't be putting technology first. We should be thinking about resiliency in our business context. And very few organizations actually know how to articulate that metric, that resilience quotient to their board. They articulate incidents, they articulate threat levels, they talk about adversaries and APT groups. I don't know how much help that really is. And very few organizations actually exist in that beautiful moment where you've got a security policy and a business alignment. That little Venn diagram of 18% of organizations actually align the two. Many talk about aligning the two, but very few actually do. And what that means is you've been able to say, this activity I'm doing on my security team relates to my business in this way. It's a really simple thing for me to say like that glibly, but it's actually quite a hard thing to express. And the outcome is, half of boards are confident. The question for me is, well, the rest are not. That's a really uncomfortable situation to be in. I genuinely think that's why security is broken and why our entire way of approaching the problem is flawed. And why we really need to think people, process, tech, not the other way around. And we have another way of thinking at it. For some of you, I used to struggle with the concept of inside out and outside in, and I really didn't understand what it meant. But for us at Optiv, it really, really means don't worry about the things you genuinely can't influence. Don't worry about Chinese hacking groups. Don't worry about Ukrainian cybercriminal gangs. Don't worry about new types of regulation. Don't worry about GDPR. Don't worry about vulnerabilities and ransomware attacks. Well, do worry about them, but worry about them in the context of your organization, what you need to achieve, what you need to do. The whole concept of crown jewel protection is the right one, but crown people protection. Think about what your organization can do first, and then worry about all of those external events. Take that sort of inside-out approach. And that's what we mean when we talk about inside-out and when my Optiv colleagues talk about inside-out, because otherwise, you're one of that 64% that are entirely reactive to external events. And that's no way to live your life or your career. And if you are completely reactive, you're not taking a strategic or an organizational approach rather than all the other stuff. And I think there's something in there which is really important. This is how we think about it. We think about optimizing programs. We think about being programmatic. There's a friend of mine who talks about being hydromatic, but I think he watched too many Grease films. But communicating effectively why you're doing what you're doing and shrinking that, everybody has, I talk about it, I have three horizons, 3 strategic horizons. I talked about this with some of you. There's a 5-minute horizon or an 8-minute horizon, which is if something's going really wrong, what are you going to do in the next 5 minutes, 8 minutes if it's space weather? There's a 5-quarter horizon, which is actually that's a budget cycle. So what am I going to do to get the right budget to put in place the right programs over the next 5 quarters? But really, to move those 2 circles over each other, it's a 5-year horizon, because that's a business planning cycle. We plan in chunks of 3, but actually we think about it in terms of 5 years. Whether it's product development, whether it's deploying new services, whether it's moving to a new region, whether it's changing how you interact with consumers, that's really a 5-year cycle. By the time you've done the R&D, developed the product, got it to market, built service adoption, that's 5 years. And if you focus just on the 5-minute or the 5-quarter horizon, you're completely lost. And you're back into this reactive mode. And that's really what brings it home to me, because whilst there's a 12% chance of a major space weather event, I went out and bought a little electric generator after that breakfast with my dear friends from the House of the Lords and just proved to them that I could run the generator. And James, Lord Arbuthnot, he said, what is that going to do? I said, well, at the very least, I'll run a fridge and I'll drink beer during the end of the world. I think he's sort of like that. I think he's got people who do his fridges for him. But the global probability of any of us facing a disruptive and significant cyber attack against our organizations next year is just about 28%. It's So when there's a significant event, I don't think we can say, I didn't know that was going to happen. And how we think about resiliency is completely different. Knowing that every complex system that exists within our organizations and every complex system that exists outside this building, to some extent, is designed to fail because they exist in a constant state of failure. People are being attacked. Cars drive into other cars. People get ill. There is crime. People don't always vote the way they should vote or might vote. These complex systems have failure built into them. And it does take a significant shock to cause them to fall over because they're designed to fail in lots of little ways. However, when you turn off all the computers, when you take out huge bits of law enforcement, as they did in Atlanta, when you pause operations across the NHS, that's significant. And we need to completely change how we think about it. And for me, it is about resiliency at its heart as the outcome, not about the technology control at the front end or the vulnerability that exploits that. And we just need to completely change our approach and how we think about these things. And that's what we're doing. That's what I'm doing, and the strategy we have is to think about this very differently, to take that inside-out approach. And whilst, yes, there may be a space weather event, interestingly, the last really big dip on space, in terms of space weather, in terms of volume, coincided almost directly with the last big ice age. We're starting, in terms of frequency and number of space weather events, to come into a new upswing in those events. So the world's only going to get hotter, which may be good for some of us. But space weather events are those things you have to plan for, you have to think about, and really lucky to be discussing that with people who think about national and regional level disaster response. But genuinely, I don't think we're thinking about that in terms of cybersecurity as the trigger, about our complex interdependent systems, about how we as individuals or society respond to it. The head of disaster response for the police, the chief superintendent of Bedfordshire Police, he got that job from his mate. I think he was the last into the room. And they all looked round and he said, "Oh, so who's going to do that then?" He said, "You are." I was like, "Thanks." He said, "If you live in a village, you're probably going to be okay." He's just sort of used to it. Everyone look after each other. He said, "If you live in a town, don't." Well, that's not massively helpful. He said, "You've got 17 hours if anyone lets you know." So that's what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to allow us to think about resiliency, look at it through the lens of massively dependent organizations, how we all really, really have to focus on thinking about how our organizations and teams understand there is a challenge and build strategies to respond to it. And that really there's a lot more to security than firewalls and routers and endpoint devices. So thank you very much.